What if the person you were meant to love was the one person you were forbidden to? Imagine a secret so powerful it could destroy your marriage and redefine your family forever. Today, we share a story of forbidden love, a father's hidden desires, and the devastating choices that follow. Get ready for a heart-wrenching tale that explores the complexities of love and family in the most unexpected way. One decision changed everything. It tore his family apart, but brought him closer to the truth about who he really was. What followed was a moment of betrayal that unexpectedly led to a bond with his son. The day had begun as usual. He had just woken up and was at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee in silence, trying to focus on the faint hum of the fridge in the corner. The soft glow from the light above illuminated the room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the tension between his wife, Sarah, and him across the entire house. He had been distant lately, but not in the way most people think. He wasn't exactly pulling away in the physical sense. Sarah still woke up beside him, they still had their dinners together, and the occasional movie night. But the emotional distance had begun to settle in like a heavy fog. They weren't fighting, but they weren't close either, and deep down he knew why. It wasn't just Sarah, and it wasn't just that they had fallen into the routine that many couples do after years of marriage. No, it was something deeper, something more primal, and it had everything to do with their son, Ethan. Ethan was 18 now, just finishing up his senior year in high school. But there was something about the way he carried himself that he couldn't shake. It was subtle, his confident swagger, the way he looked at him sometimes, the way his hands brushed against his in moments when he thought no one was watching. There was a closeness between them, a connection, but it wasn't the father-son bond he was used to. It was different. He couldn't explain it. Maybe he was just seeing things that weren't there, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt every time he looked at him. Ethan's gone to a friend's house for the night, Sarah said from behind him, her voice pulling him back to reality. He hadn't even realized she was standing there watching him. He nodded, not trusting himself to say anything. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't talk to her about this, about him, about what was happening to him. "You've been quiet lately," Sarah continued, walking toward the kitchen counter. "You've been distant. Is there something going on with you, with us?" There it was, the question he had been dreading. The question that always seemed to come up when things were starting to fall apart. He forced a smile, but he knew it was weak. "I'm fine, just a little tired, that's all." She studied him for a long moment. Her eyes narrowed, as if trying to find the words to probe deeper. But then she sighed, dropping her gaze to the counter. "I've been feeling it too, you know. I can't remember the last time well, you know." His pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. "What do you mean?" She bit her lip, clearly trying to gather her thoughts. "I mean, when was the last time we had a real conversation, a real connection? You used to tell me everything, and now..." She trailed off, her voice faltering as she turned her back to him, clearly frustrated. He swallowed hard, his heart racing. But he knew it wasn't just Sarah who was being ignored. It was him too. He had pushed her away, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to reconcile the feelings he had, the feelings he couldn't control no matter how much he tried to bury them. He could feel Sarah's eyes on him, waiting for some kind of response. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stood up abruptly, pacing toward the window. I don't know." He muttered more to himself than to her. "I feel like I'm in a fog, like everything's just..." "Is it about him?" She interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the tension. "Is this about Ethan?" He froze. Her words hung in the air thick with accusation, but also something else, something deeper, something he hadn't realized she could sense, the truth. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't because the truth was more complicated than she could ever imagine, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to admit it to himself, let alone to her. "It's not what you think," he finally managed to say. The words were hollow, and he could feel the weight of them as soon as they left his lips. Sarah's silence was louder than anything. He could feel her disappointment, her frustration building again, but she didn't say anything else. She just turned, walking toward the bedroom, but before she left the room, she paused and glanced back at him. "If you don't tell me what's really going on, I'm going to start wondering what you're hiding." He wanted to tell her. He wanted to come clean, to confess everything, to let her know how twisted things had gotten in his head, but he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Instead, he turned back to the window, watching as the street lights flickered on outside. His mind was spinning, and he felt like he was drowning in his own thoughts. Ethan, the way he looked at him, the way he made him feel, wasn't normal. He knew that, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something between them, something that neither of them could explain. The door to his room creaked open, and he glanced back to see him standing in the hallway looking at him. His eyes met his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he were testing him. He nodded quickly, trying to keep the mask of normalcy in place. "Yeah, I'm fine, just tired." Ethan didn't seem convinced. He stepped into the living room, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. There was a charged silence, and he felt that familiar tug again, the same one he couldn't escape. He was so close, just a few feet away, but it felt like they were worlds apart. "Okay," he said finally after what felt like an eternity. "I'll be in my room if you need anything." As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but watch him. And in that moment, he realized something he couldn't deny any longer. This thing between them wasn't just a passing thought. It was real, and he couldn't stop it. He didn't know how to stop it. He knew his life was about to change, that things were going to get worse before they got better. And yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it, because somewhere deep down he knew he'd already crossed the line between a father and his son, and everything else that came after it. The days after Sarah's confrontation felt like walking through fog. Every movement seemed mechanical. Every word exchanged between them seemed forced, strained. He could tell she was still watching him closely, her eyes constantly searching for some hint of the truth that he couldn't give her. But the truth was more complicated than he could admit. Ethan's presence lingered in the house like an electric charge. He was still the same boy in many ways, quiet, intelligent, focused on his future, but something had changed between them, and he couldn't ignore it, neither could he. The tension between them was palpable, like a thin thread stretched too tightly, ready to snap at any moment. He noticed the way he watched him more carefully now, his gaze lingering on him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the look of a son seeking approval, but something else, something he couldn't quite place. One evening after dinner, Ethan and he ended up alone in the living room. Sarah had retreated upstairs early, her usual quiet frustration hanging in the air. He was sitting on the couch staring blankly at the TV, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. Ethan sat down beside him, his eyes never leaving the screen, but he could feel the shift. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a weight in the air that neither of them had the courage to address. He had always been a good kid, respectful, never one to overstep boundaries. But now it felt like they were both on the edge of something dangerous, something that neither of them could control. "Dad," he said, his voice unusually soft, almost hesitant. It was as if he was testing the waters, unsure of how far he could go. He glanced over at him, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I know things have been weird lately, with you and Mom, with us." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and he felt his pulse race. He wanted to dismiss it, to act like nothing was different, but he couldn't. Everything between them had changed, and he wasn't sure if he could go back. "It's just," he continued, his eyes flicking briefly toward him before darting away, "I don't know. I guess I've been feeling like you're not really here. Like you're here, but you're not really present." He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm sorry if it feels that way. I've just been distracted." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his gaze lingering on him, studying his face. It was like he was searching for something deeper than just the surface-level exchange of words. The tension in the room grew thicker, and he could feel himself becoming more aware of him, of the way his presence filled the space around them. There was something about the way he looked at him, something raw and vulnerable, yet confident, almost daring him to look back. And for the first time, he felt a pang of something that made his stomach twist. The connection between them wasn't just fatherly. It was more than that, and it was impossible to deny any longer. He leaned back, trying to clear his thoughts. Before he could finish, he shifted closer, his arm brushing against his. The small touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he froze. It wasn't intentional, he told himself, but the way he didn't pull away, the way he didn't even seem to notice that his touch lingered, made his heart race faster. "I know things aren't great," he said again, his voice lower now, more intimate, "but I still care about you, Dad. I just want us to be okay again." The sincerity in his voice made his chest tighten, and for a moment, he almost forgot who he was. But there was no way he could forget what was happening between them. Not anymore. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, suffocating them both. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the tension that had settled between them. "I care about you too, Ethan, but you need to understand this isn't easy." "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I think we can fix it if we just talk more, if we just, connect again." His breath caught in his throat as his words seemed to pull him deeper into something he wasn't sure he could handle. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if his body had betrayed him, like he couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. Not with him. Not anymore. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain control. "Ethan, we need to be careful. We can't." But then he did something that made his heart stop. He reached out and placed his hand on his fingers brushing gently against his skin. The simple touch sent a shock of heat rushing through his body, and for a brief moment, he couldn't breathe. He didn't pull away. He didn't know how to. "I'm sorry if I've been too much," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I don't know how to fix things." The sincerity in his words was overwhelming, but there was something else too, something deeper, something more dangerous. He looked at him, his mind racing. The weight of the moment was unbearable, the pull between them undeniable. He knew he should have pulled away, should have stood up and walked out of the room before things went any further, but he didn't, he couldn't. Instead, he found himself leaning in ever so slightly, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. His eyes met his, dark and intense, and for a split second, he thought he saw something there, something that mirrored his own longing, his own confusion. He didn't move, neither did he. Then the door creaked open, and Sarah stepped into the room. The spell was broken. Ethan pulled his hand away quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment, and he snapped back to reality. Sarah stood in the doorway watching them with a look he couldn't quite decipher. The tension was thick, suffocating, and the room suddenly felt too small. I thought I heard something," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "What's going on here?" He stood up, trying to hide the panic rising in his chest. "Nothing, we were just talking." Ethan stood as well, his face pale, and for a moment, he saw something in his eyes, a mix of regret, confusion, and something else that he couldn't place. Sarah didn't say anything else. She just turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed felt deafening, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. He wanted to go after her, to explain himself, to fix what had just happened, but he couldn't fix this, not anymore. Ethan didn't speak. He just stood there, his back to him, staring at the spot where Sarah had just been. The air between them had shifted irreversibly, and he wasn't sure if he could ever go back to pretending like it hadn't. It's strange the way a moment can slip by without you realizing just how much it's going to change everything. One minute, everything feels normal. The next, the weight of it all is crushing you. Sarah's absence that evening wasn't a relief like he thought it would be. It was the exact opposite. It left an emptiness in the house that felt wrong. Her footsteps up the stairs had barely echoed when he felt that familiar pull toward Ethan again. The tension between them was undeniable now, a magnetic force that neither of them could deny, but also something neither of them knew how to handle. It wasn't just the glances anymore, the accidental touches. It was the way their bodies responded to each other, the way the air seemed to vibrate with every unspoken word. The next few days passed in a blur of awkward moments and stolen glances. Every time Ethan walked into a room, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd smile like everything was normal, like he wasn't the one whose thoughts were now tangled with his in ways they shouldn't be. But there were moments when he could tell he wasn't pretending anymore. The way his eyes would linger on him just a bit too long. The way his breath would catch when they brushed against each other in the hallway. It was all too much. Then one night it happened. Sarah had gone to bed early, the way she usually did when things were off between them. Ethan and he found themselves alone again. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and he could feel his heart racing as he stood in the kitchen wiping down the counters. He could hear his footsteps behind him before he even turned around. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. He was standing there in the doorway looking at him, the weight of his gaze pulling at him like a magnet. He tried to act calm, to force himself to be normal. "What about? I don't know how to explain this," he began, taking a step toward him, his eyes never leaving his. There was something in them, something dark and conflicted. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore it anymore." The air between them seemed to thicken, every word stretching the distance between them even though they were so close. His hands shook slightly as he placed the dish towel on the counter, unsure of what to say. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse thumping in his ears. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though the words felt hollow. How could he pretend? How could he keep lying to himself? Ethan didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them until there was barely any space left. He looked up at him, his face just inches from his. He could feel his breath on his skin, warm and steady. And he realized that at this moment, he wasn't sure if he could pull away. "I mean this," he whispered, his voice so soft that it almost felt like a secret. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face, and the simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through his body. He froze. He couldn't breathe. For a moment, nothing existed except for them. The two of them standing there in that kitchen with everything they hadn't said hanging between them. And then he kissed him. It was so unexpected, so out of nowhere, that he didn't know how to react. His lips pressed against his with a tenderness that stole the breath from his lungs. He couldn't pull away, couldn't force himself to do anything except stand there frozen. His kiss deepened, soft and searching, as if he was testing the waters, unsure whether he'd pull back or not. But he didn't. He kissed him back. He didn't know how or why it was happening. He didn't know how they'd reached this point, but he couldn't stop it. The weight of everything, the years of distance between him and Sarah, the confusing emotions he had toward his son, came crashing down on him, and he couldn't keep pretending like it wasn't real. In that moment, their bodies seemed to move of their own accord, drawn together by an irresistible force. The space between them dissolved, leaving only the thrum of tension. The kiss wasn't like anything he'd ever experienced. It was a surrender, a release from the pent-up emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface. Time stood still as their lips met, the world outside that kitchen fading into obscurity. It was just the two of them, lost in a sea of emotions, desire and fear. Every boundary, every reservation melted away, leaving only the raw, unbridled connection between them. The world outside that kitchen ceased to exist. It was just the two of them tangled in a mess of emotions, desire, and fear. Ethan pulled away first, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked at him, eyes wide, as if searching for something in his face. He was waiting for a reaction, waiting to see if he'd pull away, if he'd tell him this was wrong. But all he could do was look at him. He couldn't speak. The words didn't come. His chest felt tight, and he felt like he was drowning in his own confusion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice cracking, the weight of his regret clear in his tone. But there was something else there too, something that made his stomach churn with both guilt and longing. "I shouldn't have done that." He didn't know how to answer. How could he? The truth was he didn't regret it. Not really. He reached out, placing a hand on his arm, his fingers brushing against his skin. "Ethan, we can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's not right." He nodded, but he could see the hurt in his eyes. I didn't mean to make it weird. I just couldn't stop. Neither could I. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything he'd ever experienced. He knew he should have walked away, should have told him that this was the end of whatever this was, but he couldn't. Instead, he stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as he slowly pulled away from him. He wanted to say something, to fix it, to make everything go back to normal. But nothing felt like it would make a difference. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. "I'll go to my room," he said softly, his voice strained as he turned to leave. He didn't stop him. He couldn't. And as he walked away, he stood there in the kitchen, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He didn't know what was happening anymore. Didn't know how to process what they just shared, but he knew one thing for sure. Nothing was the same. The truth was, he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. And he didn't know if he ever could. He couldn't breathe. The seconds stretched into infinity as he stood there in the kitchen, his hands still shaking from the kiss. It felt like he had just stepped into another world. When he wasn't sure he could leave, the air in the room was thick, and the silence felt suffocating. His thoughts were scattered, broken pieces that he couldn't make sense of, and the guilt. The confusion was overwhelming. He should have stopped it. He should have pulled away, but he hadn't. Instead, he stood there paralyzed, his body betraying him as much as his mind had. The last thing he wanted was to hurt Sarah or destroy the fragile bond he'd once had with his son, but the truth was, it was already too late for that. He wandered through the house aimlessly after Ethan left, the emptiness surrounding him. He couldn't face Sarah, not after what had happened. She had no idea, and he wasn't sure he could ever look her in the eyes again without seeing the lie he had become. It was a few hours before he saw Ethan again. The house was dark except for the soft light coming from his bedroom, and when he knocked softly on his door, his heart thudded painfully in his chest. It was now or never. He couldn't avoid him anymore. He couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. When he opened the door, he was standing there in a t-shirt and pajama pants, looking like the same boy he had always been, but he wasn't, not anymore, not after what they had shared. "Dad," he said, his voice low. He seemed as uncertain as he felt. "Can we talk?" He nodded, stepping into the room. It felt strange being in here, in his space, with the weight of everything hanging between them. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he started, his eyes avoiding his as he sat down on the edge of his bed. "I never meant to hurt you. I don't know, it felt like everything was pulling us closer, and I couldn't stop myself." He could see the confusion in his eyes, the same one he was feeling. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was his son, he was his father, but the way he was looking at him, the way he spoke, it was like they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You didn't hurt me," he whispered, though he didn't even know what that meant anymore. "It's not your fault. It's just complicated. I never expected it to be like this. Ethan, I never expected you to feel this way." There was a long pause, and then he looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What happens now, Dad? Are we supposed to pretend like this didn't happen?" He shook his head, his chest tightening. I don't know what to do, but I know that we can't just go back to what we were before. It's too late for that." Ethan's gaze dropped, and he could see the pain in his eyes. "I don't want things to be messed up between us," he said quietly, his voice breaking, "but I don't want to lose you either." The words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to go back to the way things were. All he knew was that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "I don't want to lose you either," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm scared, Ethan. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what it means for us now." There was a long, painful silence between them. He could hear the clock ticking in the background, and it felt like the minutes were dragging on forever. He didn't know if he could handle it, this crushing weight of knowing that they had both felt something they shouldn't have. Finally, Ethan stood up, walking over to him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just placed his hand gently on his shoulder, his fingers warm against his skin. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. All the noise, all the confusion faded away, leaving just the two of them. "I think we need some time," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes, "to figure things out. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think we need to take a step back." He nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. He knew he was right. They needed space, time to breathe, time to think, but he also knew that things could never be the same again. "I'll give you all the time you need," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what the future held. Everything was uncertain, and the one thing he had always believed to be true, their family, was now fractured, broken by something he couldn't control. Ethan turned to leave, but then he paused, his back still to him. "I love you, Dad," he said quietly, his voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "I love you too, son," he said, the words feeling foreign on his lips, but he meant them. He always had, even when things had gotten messy, even when he didn't know what was happening anymore, he still loved him. He left the room without another word, and he stood there for a moment, listening to the faint sound of his footsteps receding down the hallway. The house felt empty again, but it wasn't just Sarah's absence he was feeling. It was everything, the weight of the past, the confusion of the present, and the uncertainty of what was to come. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He couldn't deny that what had passed between Ethan and him had been more than just a mistake. It had been a connection, something that he didn't know how to explain, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that it had broken something in him, something that couldn't be fixed with time or words. He didn't know where to go from here. All he knew was that the line had been crossed, and there was no going back. He had lost something that he could never get back, and the truth was, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. As he lay down in bed that night, the darkness surrounding him, he realized something. Sometimes the things we try to bury don't stay buried. They rise to the surface, and no matter how hard we try to ignore them, they change us forever. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how to make sense of any of it. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't lie to himself, and whatever happened now, he had to face it. He spent the next few days in a haze, not sure if he was awake or dreaming. The conversations with Ethan had been few and far between, each one leaving him with more questions than answers. It was clear they were both lost, unsure of where to go from here, unsure of what this new, unspoken bond between them meant. Sarah had noticed the shift too. He could see it in her eyes when she looked at him, the suspicion, the doubt. She didn't ask him about it, about Ethan, about what had happened, but he could feel the weight of her unspoken questions. It was like she knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know what exactly, and the silence between them only grew heavier. He found himself avoiding her when he could, pretending to be busy with work or any excuse that kept him away from her questioning gaze. It wasn't that he didn't love her, it was just that he couldn't face her. Not yet. Not when the truth about what had happened with Ethan hung over him like a storm cloud. The nights were the hardest. It was when the house was still, when the lights were off, and the only sound was the soft creak of the floorboards beneath him. He would lie awake staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet his mind. He thought about Ethan constantly. What had he done? What had they done? There was no going back, and he couldn't help but wonder if that was a good thing or a bad thing. One evening, he found himself standing in the living room looking out the window. It was dark, the street lights casting long shadows across the driveway. And for a moment, everything felt normal again, almost like the world hadn't changed, but it had, and the quiet that he had longed for had become suffocating. He heard footsteps behind him, and without turning around, he knew it was Ethan. He didn't speak at first, but he could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze resting on his back. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice still carrying that note of uncertainty that had been there ever since that night. "Are you free to talk?" He turned to face him, his heart in his throat. He didn't know what to say to him anymore. He didn't know if he could ever look at him the same way again. But somehow he knew they needed to talk because the silence between them wasn't helping either of them heal. "What is it?" he asked, his voice betraying the exhaustion he was feeling. "I don't know," he said, his words heavy. I think we need to figure out what happens next, you and me, I mean." He nodded slowly, unable to look him in the eye. The weight of what had happened hung between them, and the uncertainty of their future was like a sharp edge he couldn't escape. They didn't need to say the words. They both knew things had changed forever, and as he stood there waiting for some kind of answer, he realized something. No matter how much he wanted to go back to the way things were, there was no going back. They were both lost in this, and the only thing he could do now was face the consequences, whatever they might be. They were two people, father and son, caught in a moment that neither of them could fully understand, and perhaps that was all they could do, accept the weight of their actions and figure out how to move forward from here, even if they didn't know what that meant. If you're moved by this emotional story, please give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to LGBT Stories for more compelling and heart-wrenching tales from the LGBT community. Tell us what you thought about this story in the comments below. Your thoughts and feelings are important to us. Thank you for watching.